Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Ryan Berg. I'm the Director of the Americas Program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for what should be an excellent conversation on building the North American Semiconductor Corridor. Before we formally begin, I want to talk a little bit about the logistics of today's event. This event will last approximately 90 minutes. Following the moderated portion of our discussion today, we'll field some questions from the audience. On the back of the chairs in front of you, if you're here in the live audience, you'll see a QR code. For our virtual audience, please submit questions by clicking on the button Ask Live Questions, and it will be filtered to us for the Q&A portion of today's event. Please note that a recording of this event will be made available on the webpage following the end of today's discussion. From the smartphones in our hands to the fighter jets cruising the sky, semiconductors enhance medical devices, impact energy, finance, transportation, manufacturing, aerospace, and defense. There's really no industry that this doesn't impact. And for this reason, maintaining access to the semiconductor supply chain is not only a matter of economic prosperity, but also of national security, and I would dare to say our modern survival. As tension between China and the United States intensifies, semiconductor supply chains will increasingly be subject to intense geopolitical competition. In this regard, North America has the potential to serve as a critical buffer in the US-China competition by combining the strengths of the United States, Canada, and Mexico and increasing production levels right here at home or in our neighbors. In the 1990s, the United States produced nearly 40% of the world's chips, as opposed to about 12% that it produces today. As of 2022, 3/4 of the world's chips were manufactured in East Asia. Recognizing this situation and coming out of the pandemic context, Congress has taken action. The CHIPS and Science Act is a leap forward, ensuring that North America builds redundancy and resiliency into the semiconductor supply chain, with literally billions of dollars in incentives, subsidies, and tax breaks to build out semiconductor fabs in the United States and to create funds for cooperation with international partners. Most recently, the North American Semiconductor Conference held this past May, which fulfilled the pledge of the 3 leaders at the North America Leaders Summit in January, also laid the groundwork for trilateral talks regarding this important industrial effort. Still, the challenges that North America faces in becoming a semiconductor powerhouse are manifold. High levels of international competition, workforce gaps, lack of policy coordination, and ongoing international trade disputes are just some of the most evident obstacles that the 3 countries will face as they work towards becoming a major semiconductor hub. To unpack the advantages and disadvantages that North America has in building the hemisphere's semiconductor corridor and what each country can do to nurture that growth, we have an outstanding panel joining us today. First, to my immediate left, we have Max Hamilton, who's the Director of North America at the National Security Council. Max has had a long career in the Foreign Service as a Foreign Service officer. He previously served as Special Assistant to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Tom Shannon. He also served as the State Department's Burma Unit Chief and in the State Department's Operations Center, and his multiple diplomatic assignments have included postings in India and Venezuela. I know how busy it is at the NSC. I know how hard it is to break away on occasion from the NSC, so thanks very much for taking the time today, Max. Thanks. Second, joining us by Zoom, we have Rena Powell-Gutson, the Director of Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association. At SIA, as it's known, she is responsible for the association's international trade policy agenda, including trade agreements, market access, and emerging market development. Before joining SIA, Rena was General Counsel of 3D Printed Microtech, the leader in 3D printed chip packaging in San Francisco, California. Prior to that, Rena focused on trade and global intellectual property policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and was a director at the George Washington University Law School. Third, and also to my left, we have Dr. David Talbot, who's Associate Director of Economic Policy at the Milken Institute. He leads finance research and policy programming on economics and geopolitics and directs key components of initiatives on economic competitiveness, sustainable growth, and the energy transition. He previously served in the Obama administration as policy advisor for international economics to U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker. David played a central role in designing Secretary Pritzker's commercial diplomacy strategy and developing signature initiatives to strengthen U.S. economic relations with India, ASEAN, and Canada and Mexico, increase exports and inbound foreign direct investment, and promote responsible business conduct. And lastly, and joining us by Zoom, we have Sam Marullo, who's the Director of CHIPS Policy and Senior Advisor to Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Prior to this position, Sam worked as Policy Director to Governor Raimondo. With over 10 years of experience, Sam has worked as a business analyst and policy advisor for both public and private entities. I've asked each one of our panelists to prepare about 5 minutes of opening remarks today. Then we'll move into a moderated portion of the discussion. Max, I want to begin with you. Thanks again for being here. Over to you for your opening remarks.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, David, Rena, and Sam. It's a privilege to be with you all today. I appreciate your interest in this topic and your willingness to come here and listen to us speak about it. So let me start by talking a little bit about the Biden administration's philosophy or kind of strategic logic when it comes to North America and semiconductors. If you look at the Biden administration's national security strategy, it really puts North America at the center of the Western Hemisphere in terms of our policy priorities. And I think that recognizes that North America is central to the security and prosperity of the American people, and it's central to this notion of a foreign policy for the middle class. And I think we have a good story to tell about how we're using North America and North American Leaders Summit, which we had in January of last year, and which we're looking forward to having again this year, early next year, to drive this agenda. We have a good story to tell also on the legislative front through the CHIPS and Science Act, which is $52 billion for investment in semiconductors, the Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion to support clean energy, and the Defense Production Act, which we're using with Canada to develop semiconductor packaging and printed circuit boards and so forth. And so the idea here is that if we can harness our collective productive capacity with Canada and Mexico, we can build products faster, we can build them more efficiently and at lower cost, and we can use this to export to the rest of the world. During the last North American Leaders Summit in Mexico in January, we had 27 deliverables, many of which were focused on this competitiveness agenda, and many of which were specifically focused on semiconductors. So just in May, we hosted the first ever North American Semiconductor Conference with Mexico and Canada. This included participation of the private sector and academia, because there's a recognition that governments alone are not really great at doing supply chains and not building semiconductor supply chains. We need the participation of the private sector and academia to do this better. And this was something that we hope to build upon in the next North American Leaders Summit. Already, our Canadian colleagues have expressed interest in hosting another North American Semiconductor Conference. And I think we can use this forum to further build our supply chains. So look forward to the discussion and happy to talk more about any of these priorities or what we're doing to advance in these areas.
Thank you very much, Max. Rena, over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'd like to kind of describe actually what the Semiconductor Industry Association does. We advance policies that help the industry grow and unite semiconductor companies around common challenges. So SIA seeks to strengthen U.S. leadership in semiconductor manufacturing, design, and research by working with Congress, the administration, and key industry stakeholders to encourage policies and regulations that fuel innovation, propel business, and drive international competition. Of course, key to what we're talking about here, the North America Semiconductor Corridor, is the U.S. CHIPS Act. So since that was passed, there's been a lot of commitments now already made, $210 billion in new company investment commitments, and that has spurred a lot of other pieces of the supply chain. I think key to building this alliance in North America is rebalancing the supply chain and increasing the resiliency that we have for the global semiconductor supply chain that will flow from these new investments. the meeting that we had last month highlighted kind of the interest that Canada, the US, and Mexico has in participating in this. The US already leads in several key segments of the value chain, specifically high value add and research intensive parts. I think what is very obvious is that the US, despite the US CHIPS Act, cannot do everything alone, and we need partners. And bringing that closer in the North America region makes a lot of sense for the resiliency. Canada's semiconductor industry, while small relative to the chip sector in the US, has quite a bit of the global chip companies conducting R&D and chip design located in Vancouver and in British Columbia. Mexico is also already a hub for semiconductor assembly and test operations, and several multinational companies have major back-end chip operations in Mexico, and others are growing their chip engineering and design workforce in the country. This, coupled with some of the minerals that are rich in Canada and can be used for manufacturing in the semiconductor industry, leaves a lot of areas to be further explored and to really shore up the supply chain. There's a few challenges that still exist, and we think that, if we focus on strengthening this North America semiconductor corridor, 4 areas really need to be addressed. First is the workforce development. There's a shortage of qualified workers in the technology industry globally, and North America is no exception. So to address this partnership could look at more university partnerships across 3 countries, and look at having governments work together in upskilling efforts and launch training programs together with the companies. Research and development. One of the key motivations behind this corridor is to ensure that North America remains at the forefront of technological innovation and development. So with the right government support, we could also make sure that the curriculum stays up to date and relevant for jobs in the industry, and in creating consortiums between the research institutions, for example, in collaborating with the National Semiconductor Technology Center. Third, of course, is coordinating mutually beneficial government incentives from tax breaks, grants, and funding for research and development. And lastly, exploring the critical mineral extraction in an environmentally protected way. So it's always been a challenge, of course, to be able to have sustainable manufacturing methods for this industry, but it's critically important. And we can leverage the NASC to explore kind of a clean and sustainable processing that would also be competitive. So the goal here, is that NASC can hold a great promise as a critical platform to help rebalance the global semiconductor supply chain and bring more of the manufacturing pieces in assembly, test, packaging, and design to North America. And SIA is looking forward to helping collaborate on these new efforts in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rena, for those opening remarks. Dr. Talbot, over to you for yours.
Thanks so much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to Max, Rena, and Sam for all of your excellent work on what's a very important subject that has become very near and dear. So I today would like to leave you with 4 key points that draw from a shameless plug here, my 2 recent reports on this topic published through the Milken Institute. So one on strengthening US-Mexico semiconductor supply chains, and then the second, which was at the invitation of Rena and Arizona State University, the summary of conclusions and recommended actions from the North America Semiconductor Conference. So the first point, as my colleagues have already shared, is that the CHIPS Act has opened a tremendous but brief moment of opportunity for deeper regional integration on semiconductor supply chains. So the CHIPS Act in particular has catalyzed a global restructuring of semiconductor supply chains driven in response to intensification of US-China tensions, disruptions fueled by the COVID-19 pandemic, and subsequently the war in Ukraine. So the CHIPS Act has led to this sort of wave of new fab investment that's accelerated demand across supply chain segments. But the reason that I underscore brief is because the capital intensity of the industry, the decisions are being made now and over the course of the next 12 months, if not even less, that will decide sort of the future footprint of this industry in the years ahead. The second key point is that North America is very well positioned to capitalize on this opportunity. In particular, Canada and Mexico have an opportunity, a great chance to integrate more deeply into US-led supply chains based on a series of competitive advantages. So first, as already been mentioned, there's a sort of pre-existing complementary ecosystems. I think proximity is a second and often underrated point within the industry. So many of the US fabs, new and existing, are along the northern and southern borders, both in upstate New York, Texas, Arizona. So just the benefits of co-location and proximity are only growing, particularly with the sort of higher complexity of packaging. So the third is USMCA, which I don't need to tell anybody in this room what the many benefits are of operating semiconductor supply chains within the deeply integrated North American market. I think fourth, and very similarly, is that there is a high density and deep integration of end users within the North American production platform that would benefit from a more densely interwoven set of regional semiconductor supply chains. And I think finally, something that Max alluded to is this very dense existing policy architecture. So you have the NOLs. I was very thrilled to see the HLED relaunched by the current governments. The NASC, which it's great to hear is hopefully continuing. And I'm very excited to see how the NASC plugs into the new North American Ministerial Committee on Economic Competitiveness that was announced during the NASC. So the third key point, I realize I'm getting my numbers a bit confused here for everybody, is that significant barriers remain despite this opportunity. I think that's particularly true as it relates to integrating Mexico, which has a smaller, even though significant, existing footprint. And that is the main focal point of my latest report. So I think there's a huge opportunity here, but there are a number of key issues that we need to address in a very collaborative fashion. And I'm going to get to this in the fourth point. I think the US has a bigger role to play here as well. But some of the biggest challenges that I've identified include cost competitiveness, data availability, workforce development, as Rena so appropriately mentioned, sort of infrastructure challenges, access to reliable and renewable energy and water, and then rule of law and security concerns. Fourth and final point, before turning it back over to you, Ryan, is that there is nevertheless a very clear path forward on this, and very significant progress is already being made. So in terms of policy recommendations, I think there still is work that needs to be done on the Mexican side to develop and disseminate a more concerted strategy to recruit ATP, so back-end segments of the supply chain, and further build out the ecosystem. But I was in Mexico City last week and heard some very promising updates on that front that I'm happy to get into later. As I just mentioned, I think that there's far more just beyond ITSE that the US can do to support these efforts to build out the back-end ecosystem in Mexico, things including joint investment promotion, technical assistance, project financing. And then third, overall, this is something that would benefit a number of sectors and sort of brings Canada back into the fold as well, but is figuring out additional ways to drive progress in the bilateral and trilateral investment agenda. So, border infrastructure investment, regulatory cooperation, sort of figuring out how to address the energy dispute in a more collaborative fashion. And then, one thing I'm hearing a lot from industry is the importance of customs modernization and really building out the trilateral platform. So, in closing here, it's what I think is a very exciting opportunity. I think it's critically important for resilience, for national security, for economic security, and commend you for hosting an event to raise further awareness on the issue.
Thanks very much, Dave, and I'll get back into some of your policy recommendations in the moderated portion of today's discussion. Over to you, Sam, for your opening remarks. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, everyone. Appreciate you having me on this panel, having the Commerce Department on this. I'll start by saying I agree with what a lot of my co-panelists have said. I think they have hit a lot of the key points here, which is that there is tremendous potential. The CHIPS and Science Act opens up a window for us and for our allies to think about how we want to shape this industry going forward. And like you said at the beginning, Ryan, this is an industry that is core to really all of the industries of the future. And so this is a problem that is worth a good amount of thought. A few things to add from the Commerce Department perspective. The first is that we spend a lot of our time at the Commerce Department thinking about supply chains. That includes what we're talking about here. It also includes, for example, over the last few years, supply chain challenges from the pandemic, from the war in Ukraine, from different geopolitical situations that have caused business disruptions. Companies, and I think we're seeing a shift, in part because of the Biden agenda, we're seeing a shift in how companies think about their supply chains. Companies are making new decisions about this. They're nearshoring where they can, and they're thinking more about risk and resilience in a way that they haven't been, at least recently. They haven't been prioritizing recently. And like my co-panelists have said, this is a big opportunity for North America. We can build supply chains right here. We can ensure the availability of key inputs before the next crisis. And we bring economic activity to the US and to our neighboring countries for the benefit of workers in all three countries. This opportunity, though, is now. It's not going to last forever. I talked about the CHIPS and Science Act, and I talked about the law's funding for supercharging the US semiconductor industry. It also creates significant opportunities for Canada and Mexico. I think David said this, but like David said, as we are building up new fabs in the United States, they largely have been around the northern and southern borders. And so that does create opportunities for these three countries to work together to build out a robust semiconductor ecosystem on both sides of the border. I would also add, although it's not the focus of this panel, I'd also add the Inflation Reduction Act and the funding there to help curb emissions and spur demand for electric vehicles and clean energy technologies. So as companies diversify their semiconductor fab investments, that opens up opportunities for partnerships across a bunch of areas in this ecosystem. But I think the biggest one, and the one that folks are talking about most right now, is for back-end operations, such as assembly, testing, and packaging. And so at the Commerce Department, we certainly welcome efforts to expand these operations in North America, and believe that collaboration on refining these processes can help strengthen our collective supply chain resiliency. Last point, we know that companies are making these investment decisions now. I have heard from companies that they are considering North America. They are also considering other regions of the world for these investments, some of which are offering large incentive packages in order to attract those investments. And so we need to be honest with ourselves about what's possible and also creative with solutions if we're going to address this challenge. If we get this right, though, and I think we can, we're going to be in a position to lead North American efforts and world efforts to take advantage of this sort of realignment of the industry and help support supply chain resilience and secure greater prosperity for all of us. So I'll just close by saying governments clearly have an important role to play in ensuring that the conditions are right for collaboration. But this is very much a government-private sector joint effort, and we won't succeed without everyone participating in it. So thanks, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sam, for those opening remarks. We're now going to move into the moderated portion of the discussion this afternoon. And Max, I want to start with you. You handle the North America portfolio at the NSC. You gave us a very clear understanding of where North America fits within the Biden administration's national security strategy and how we're thinking about it in terms of an economic hub, a source of resiliency for our supply chains. Give me a sense of where does the NASC go from here? Where does the North American Semiconductor Conference go from here? You mentioned that it's going to continue being a venue for these important conversations. You were there, you participated. Where does it go in future, in your opinion?
Well, so the NASC was a deliverable that we developed at the North American Leaders Summit in Mexico in January. And we fulfilled that deliverable with the help of SIA, with the help of Arizona State University, and a bunch of, and Mexico and Canada. we are in the process of completing the other 27 deliverables that we had from the North American Leader Summit right now, many of which are related to, that wasn't a joke, but I realize it sounds like one, many of which are related to competitiveness and diversity, equity, inclusion, security, migration, and so forth. So the way this process works from a government's perspective is that we'll also begin thinking about what are going to be the deliverables for the next summit. And I think that all three countries are committed to building on what we did in the last summit. Supply chain mapping was definitely one of the areas of focus. I think workforce development is clearly another area of focus. And so I can see us building on that effort in the next North American Leaders Summit and in the next iteration of the North American Semiconductor Conference. And I would just add that from my perspective, from where I sit, I think there is an alignment among the three governments at the leadership level with Prime Minister Trudeau, President Lopez Obrador, and President Biden in terms of thinking about how we can strengthen North America as this collective platform to produce things together, to have stronger, more resilient supply chains together, to bring things back to North America. I think there is a commonality of views there. Sometimes the rhetoric that the leaders may use to talk about it is different, admittedly, and there are some areas of disagreement that we have to work through. And one of the reasons why we extended the electrical vehicle tax credit to Canada and Mexico was in response to their views on this issue. But I think there is a similar vision there, and the North American Leaders Summit is really like our signature event to align leaders' views and then have the three governments follow up on those priorities. And so I think that as we look towards the next one, we'll want to think about how we can build on the progress we've made so far. I think those two specific areas of supply chain mapping and workforce development will be priorities. I think with the private sector and academia, again, we'll want to think about how we can move forward in those areas.
Thanks, Max. Rena, I want to go to you. I mean, perhaps the phrase that we've heard most often, it's been in every set of opening remarks we've heard so far, is moving supply chains to North America. And I mentioned in my opening remarks that about 3/4 of the world's chips are made in Asia, Southeast Asia. So moving them from somewhere else, and of course this brings up the question of partners like Taiwan, who for historical reasons have been some of the main producers of semiconductors. When we're talking about reorienting supply chains, this will require efforts, I think, on the part of the United States, Canada, and Mexico to manage some of the diplomatic relationships here when it comes to moving some of those supply chains that we're trying to move. So how can North America mitigate the impact on their trade relations with countries in East and Southeast Asia, from which presumably some of these supply chains would be moving?
I think the countries in Southeast Asia, which have quite a large piece of the supply chain, have been doing this for many decades. So the governments are very well versed in having incentives in place, single window business offices and things like that, which make it very streamlined for companies to be able to do trade and to be able to move items in and out of the country, which is very necessary for this industry. So it will be a challenge to try to move those at all. Of course, the idea of rebalancing the supply chain is that as we are ramping up on manufacturing in the U.S., there is going to be larger pieces of the puzzle. And also moving those closer in location to the U.S. would make this more globally secure in the event of another shock to the system, somewhat like the pandemic was, or something else that might happen for security reasons and things. But it'll be a challenge, as you just mentioned. One of the main issues is the government incentives. We don't really have a coordinated approach to that across this region for Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and that needs to be addressed because costs are higher here than they are where the supply chain is already located in Asia. And further than that, to remain competitive, it will be difficult to compete in certain areas. For instance, in the processing of these critical minerals, if industry were to be established in Canada, there would need to be significant government incentives because doing it in an environmentally clean way costs much more than what's happening in China now. And China is doing the vast majority of this processing of the minerals. So there will need to be some more investment, I think, across the board from all three of these countries to be able to move the pieces of the supply chain. I think there's tremendous interest. Trade is very simple, of course, across these three countries. And, things are close, so that helps a lot. But of course, if it's not kind of financially feasible, it would be very difficult to convince any of the companies to make decisions that are not in the best interest for their stakeholders and shareholders as well. So I think we need to be realistic about that. Many of the states in Mexico are trying to create their own state level incentives, which are attractive. However, the companies already have their footprint in certain places, which are not necessarily the places that are offering incentives like this or are being grown, and regions which are trying to become new corporate parks for investment with electricity and water. So there needs to be some kind of federal collaboration and a federal level incentives, I think, to make this really work. So I don't think it needs to be the same. I think most of the industry agrees that there are significant advantages to being located in North America. So although it doesn't need to really be dollar for dollar and compete with every other location, every other location, it still does need to come somewhat close in order to make that argument, I think, to their own boards and shareholders.
Thanks, Rena. Dave, I want to come back to you. You gave us an excellent précis of your recent report. I commend it to the audience. It's really a fantastic report. I want to ask you a two-part question. The first is, what does a more resilient North American supply chain get the United States in terms of its needs? That's from a global economic security perspective, right? So give us a sense of, from all of your research on this, what it actually looks like and what does it get us in terms of our overall strategy, right? So situated within the overall strategy. And then the second part is, give us a couple updates on the CDMX trip. You mentioned that in your opening remarks. Let's unpack that a little bit so that we can have updates from on the ground recently. You were just there last week, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. No, thank you for the shameless plug. So tackling them in order. So first question, what does a more resilient North American supply chain get the U.S.? So I think this is a key point that we've heard over and over again from Max, from the CHIPS team at Commerce, from SIA, is that, particularly from the Hill, is that the Act is a national security bill as much as it is a economic competitiveness bill. So the principal goals here being to both enhance and bolster U.S. research and development capabilities, and then also reshore fabrication to address some of the the imbalances that both you and Rena have referred to. I think one of the key points here, though, is that the CHIPS Act does not try to, nor will it, reshore all segments of the supply chain, and that frankly should not be the goal of the U.S. because it's not cost competitive. It's would further exacerbate tensions with allies, like we just heard. So there are still fairly significant gaps that need to be addressed to ensure resilience and to deliver this rebalancing that Rena's talking about. And I think she captured very well that this is a large part of rebalancing driven by new investment rather than sort of a actual physical relocation of existing plants and facilities, which there have been some studies done on this. Even for a less capital intensive ATP facility, you're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars to actually physically move an existing plant, which is just unlikely. So North American integration, what does it get us to actually address some of these gaps? So, from the Canadian perspective, the critical minerals piece is key. Semiconductor manufacturing requires nearly every single element in the periodic table. So if we're able to shift some of the sort of fulfillment of those needs for these new U.S. fabs from China to Canada, and obviously Mexico has some critical minerals capacities as well, as do other parts of the hemisphere, is one main thing. And then the second is, as Max mentioned, is that Canada already has a small but robust advanced packaging ecosystem in place, which I'm guessing is a big part of the reason why Micron made their big investments in upstate New York, because that's part of what's being called this northeastern industrial corridor now. I think Mexico, in many ways, since it is a more nascent ATP ecosystem, is even more interesting and complicated and promising part of this equation. Because what Mexico currently brings to the table, so there are four back-end facilities. So Texas Instruments has one in Aguascalientes, then it's Infineon and Skyworks jointly have three in Baja. So there is this existing ATP footprint in place, and one of the reasons the supply chain mapping portion of the NASC is so important is to figure out the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 supplier network that already exists in Mexico around this. Because I think the ATP components is just another tremendous opportunity for building out resilience. And the back end, one of the reasons the back end is so important is because the U.S. is focusing on reshoring fabrication in particular, and obviously advanced packaging is also part of the CHIPS Act. But you have the R&D here, you have design, you're obviously working with other allies. But if you get to the back end and you still sort of in a worst case scenario are having to in a worst case scenario, it is not necessarily a worst case scenario, shipping U.S. fabricated chips back across the Pacific for the final stage of the manufacturing, your resilience strategy goes out the window. And frankly, the same is true with device assembly, which I think is sort of a very closely related but not as widely discussed part of this. So Mexico really brings a lot of the competitive advantage to the table to be able to fill this need, particularly for all the legacy chips that we're seeing are essential to a lot of the end users that are already very integrated in the North American platform. They're going to become even more important, as Sam mentioned, with the IRA and sort of the explosion in demand for EVs. Some stats on this point. So the U.S. has only 3% of global ATP capacity as it currently stands, and no competitive suppliers of printed circuit boards and substrate. And Asia has 81% of global ATP capacity and 95% of substrate suppliers. And China actually has 80% of global PCB capacity. So that was one of the things, I was in Mexico City last week to actually launch and roll out this report. Had a number of really good meetings with Economia, with SRE, with CCE, a number of the business groups, a number of the end users. And I think that there's a real surge in momentum that came out of the NASC. I think there is very clear recognition that the window is short, that it is time to act, that the opportunity is here, and I think very powerful messaging as well that that this is not simply an opportunity for the U.S., but that the U.S. really needs Mexico to play this role within regional supply chains, which is why I get back to this point about sort of what more the U.S. can also do to help facilitate this, given the I think very extensive subsidy incentive packages that are offered in Southeast Asia, and the frankly the I think the challenges with trying to match those in a North American context. Some of the most promising things I heard on the front end is that the CCE, working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce through the U.S.-Mexico CEO dialogue, actually organized a delegation of Taiwanese PCB manufacturers that is in Mexico now, or may have just left, and was speaking both with the federal government and also a number of the states. I think that speaking with Economia, there's already been very significant progress made on one of the key deliverables from the North American Semiconductor Conference, which is the integration of workforce skills and sort of talent mapping into this regional the supply chain mapping, which I think is such a critical part of this piece. And I could go on and on here, but it was very clear to me that that there is
a lot of movement on this, that the NASC was a success and has really, I think, kick-started the next phase of this dialogue. So, with the opportunity sitting next to Max here and speaking with Sam, I would really urge you to, look at ways to integrate that work plan directly into the first iteration of this North American Competitiveness or Ministerial Committee on Competitiveness, because, I think you need to, it gives it a much more sort of formal home for that work plan, as opposed to counting on sort of a repeated iteration of the NASC.
Thanks, David. Sam, I want to come to you. In the CHIPS and Science Act, there is a $500 million fund for international cooperation, and because we're in the mood to plug reports, CSIS has done a fantastic report on the fund. Our Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for the Economics Program, Aaron Murphy, has done a fantastic report on the fund. It's known as ITSE, International, otherwise known as the International Fund. Its proper name is International Technology, Security, and Innovation Fund. And it has $500 million in it to be spent down over 5 years to work with partners internationally on issues related to chips and science. So my question to you, Sam, is what opportunities might there be for some of that money in the International Fund to be used in North America?
Thanks for that question. And I do want to answer that. Before I get to that, I want to just quibble slightly with one question you asked prior about, I think you asked this to Rena, about the relocation of supply chains. And I would just say, and David brought this up too, I think no one's really talking about relocation of supply chains. We're talking about investment patterns. We're talking about making sure that we are investing in the United States. We all benefit from supply chain diversification, supply chain resiliency. And so adding another region to the list of regions that's producing advanced semiconductors, or just bumping up capacity on semiconductors generally, is something that benefits us, but also benefits all of our allies and partners. So just thought I would make that point before I answer your question. On the ITSE fund, that is something that we are quite engaged with. As you may know, the State Department is in charge of running that fund rather than the Commerce Department. Of the 50-some billion dollars in the CHIPS part of the CHIPS and Science Act, the Commerce Department has 50, and then this 500 million is in the State Department. That said, there certainly are opportunities for us to use this fund within North America, or at least to encourage further development within North America. I would say the kind of things that come to mind immediately, understanding that the State Department has a process that they are running through for determining how this fund will be spent, is the kinds of things we've been talking about already. It's things like thinking about whether there's opportunities for back-end production or packaging in Mexico or similar countries. It's thinking about critical minerals and other things that may be possible. It's doing studies of benefits or supply chain resilience benefits of locating some of these pieces closer to us. I will say the $500 million, although it sounds like a lot of money, and I will say I worked in state government before I came to the federal government, and in state government, $500 million would be a lot of money. In the context of this industry, it is surprisingly small. And so as we are thinking about this, I want to be clear, it's not going to be the kind of thing where government can come in and fund creation of the kinds of things we want to see. It's not going to be government coming in and saying, we need packaging here, and so we're going to fund the creation of the packaging plant. The scale of this industry, and frankly, the profitability of this industry just means that doesn't make a lot of sense here. What it is going to be instead is, how can government support? How can government help? Where are there opportunities that aren't yet being studied, aren't yet being captured? Where can we bring in other people to help? Where can we convene folks, including CHIPS customers, which someone mentioned, given that we all benefit from the supply chain resiliency? And in some cases, maybe it's how can we provide some of the funding that is necessary to get a project off the ground before private funding comes through, or as private funding is being accessed. So all that to say, I think there's a lot of opportunity to use the ITSE fund to support this kind of work. Exactly how that plays out is still yet to be seen.
Thanks very much. Sam, Max, I want to turn to you and ask a question about Mexico and some of the trade disputes that were mentioned in a few of the opening remarks for today's event. Recent trade disputes under the USMCA have created some tensions between US, Mexico, and Canada in terms of the trilateral relations. Do you foresee any similar types of dispute potentials in the semiconductor industry, or are we pretty much smooth sailing on that front?
Well, I've been an American diplomat long enough to know that there's a lot of danger in making predictions about that kind of thing. I would say, though, that in the short term, and I could be wrong, in the short term, I don't see that being an area of contention. In fact, I think, like some of the other panelists have said, our vision on semiconductors with Mexico is very much aligned. I think I would echo what other people have said about this kind of window of opportunity that Mexico has to move forward. Mexico is perfectly positioned to benefit from these global shifts in supply chains. And we're seeing that they are benefiting to some degree. The industrial parks along the border are filling up. They've been getting a lot of FDI, particularly in autos and electronics. And that's all good. But with the right mixture of policies, they could do even better. And that involves, maybe having a single window for some of these projects, which is something we've heard from industry. It involves, incentives at the state level, incentives at the national level, and this is a message that the private sector I know has communicated to the Mexican government. We've talked about it as well because we think it is truly mutually beneficial. It would be good for Mexico and it would be good for us as well. I think only something like 3% of the packaging of semiconductors is done in the United States or North America, and to the extent that Mexico can be involved in that, it can help address the issue that David mentioned, which is you make chips here and then you have to send them overseas to be packaged. So I think more than anything, I just see the risk being unwillingness or inability to move fast enough to take advantage of this particular moment in time. And I think we have to figure out ways that we can kind of help move this forward, and that's part of what some of these institutional mechanisms that David also referenced are all about. Like the high-level economic dialogue is precisely about this. The North American Leaders Summit is precisely about this. It's what the president talks about when he goes to Mexico and when he goes to Canada. I have not perceived a difference of kind of vision when it comes to semiconductors. It's just can we move fast enough?
This is the importance of having such robust trinational institutions between the three countries, as we have the existing architecture in place already to make things happen, but also to have these important conversations. Rena, I want to go to you asking a question about Canada. I'm often reminded in these conversations about North America and building the North American Semiconductor Corridor that we pay too little attention to Canada, and I think it's a true criticism. Too often this conversation seems to neglect Canada. We focus a lot on Mexico and even more on the US. So you mentioned in your comments, critical minerals, the importance of mining, using subsidies to make sure it's done cleanly. What are some of the opportunities and challenges for Canada here with building the North American Semiconductor Corridor?
Sure. Canada, kind of to address the design area first before we get into the critical minerals. Canada already has quite a few companies, domestic companies that are all the way from startups to a little bit more established that are focusing on chip design, especially in the MEMS area, and they're a leader in AI. So I think there's tremendous opportunity there. They are coordinating government incentives, as more global players are getting involved in Canada and setting up operations there. I think there's a great opportunity as well in proximity from the Ontario area to have university partnerships in New York and things, and across the border also further west, to be able to kind of collaborate with universities to have a talent pool and to further grow their design area. On the critical mineral side, Canada is rich in the critical minerals that are needed for this industry, but there isn't much by way of an industry in processing those minerals. So that is still largely done in China. And to be able to change that is something which could potentially be one thing that comes out of the NASC. Mexico also has many companies that are skilled in mining and processing. So I think that there could be potential for collaboration between the three countries as we kind of could bring together potential partners to establish an area like this. I understand Canada also has very strong regulations about mining, and definitely for new areas or greenfield. So this could also be, a challenge and needs to be looked into further. Aside from this, of course, there are movements away from the PFAS and other chemicals that are necessary for this industry, and are currently being researched on how to find alternatives and substitutes for this. And I think that there also remains an opportunity, for instance, for the US and Canada to work together on research on this, to be able to find alternatives and find solutions there as well. Certainly Canada, I think, is interested in building a SIA type of model in Canada to be able to have more industry input, and maybe to be able to work closer together with the government there to be able to organize incentives and things that would make sense for this.
Thank you very much, Rena. And since we've already crossed the Rubicon of shameless promotion, I will mention that CSIS Americas has done, we've done a lot of work on mining. We plan on continuing to do work on sustainable mining. And one of the things in particular that we're looking at in some upcoming work is this question of refining in the North America area. So exactly to your point, Rena. Dave, I want to turn to you and ask a question about the overall supply chain. Each country, Canada, Mexico, and the US, specializes in a different facet of the semiconductor industry, as I think you've so rightly pointed out in your report and said today here in your remarks. So how do you think that each country's specialization will benefit their economy? And then the second part of the question is, are there risks that are created by some of the disparities between the three countries in terms of what we're hoping that they do within the supply chain, such a level of specialization?
I think it's a great question. There's, I think, one point that's been threaded throughout these questions and responses that I'd first like to touch on, which is, I think that, going back to Sam's point about the size of the ITSE fund, I would love to see the future NASC at the future, first meeting of the competitiveness committee, an even broader range of, U.S. agencies at the table that can help actually increase, the size of those funds and sort of the availability of technical expertise. I think it was one thing that was missing from the NASC is we didn't have a DFC at the table. We didn't have a USTDA at the table. So there wasn't anyone there who was really able to sort of get into these questions of technical assistance, of project finance. Similarly, you could see, Select USA doing joint promotion efforts with state and federal EDOs because of these border investments. It's mutually beneficial for everybody involved. So just wanted to throw that out there before going on. But to return to your question about how make sure I'm getting this right. So how the respective specializations of each of the three countries sort of within this very complex supply chain benefits their economies, and if there's a risk of disparities, or what was the last part?
Right, if there's any risk of creating disparities between the three countries given their respective areas of specialization. We understand that the whole idea of specialization is that you do some things well and you do other things less well. But if there are any risks in thinking about it that way, risks on the horizon that we should think about or plan for.
Here I will parrot some of the points that Max made previously, because I think that I'm less concerned about
disparities through specialization in the semiconductor industry than I am some others. I think in part because the three countries occupy not only different niches within the semiconductor firm, but also because there's sort of a clear differential in the sort of existing capacities of the industry. So there are different opportunities available. So obviously the U.S. CHIPS Act has created tensions with some international allies, including the Europeans, where there's much more direct competition over sort of these key supply chain segments. I think they like other regions like to point out that despite the U.S. declining share of fabrication, it remains dominant in many but not all of the high value added segments. The industry itself, this is drawing on the great data produced by the SIA, is a huge contributor to the U.S. economy, both directly and indirectly. Semiconductors remain the fourth largest U.S. export, which is probably a surprising fact given the conversation that we're having here today. And the industry directly employs 300,000 Americans, indirectly accounts for another 1.6 million jobs. So I think here for the U.S., it's reinforcing, it's strengthening this industry leader position. And Canada and Mexico also play different roles than one another. And we keep coming back to this idea of complementarity. So, for Canada, as Rena just mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity in upstream inputs, design, specialized fabrication, advanced packaging. And for Mexico, it's, I think, a huge potential win to get a foothold in the back end specifically. They have a design presence as well. Intel has a facility in Guadalajara, but I think the most immediate sort of prospective opportunities are in the back end. And then by gaining a foothold in this industry, looking ahead sort of, 5, 10 years, 15 years as you get to the next one of these very sort of intensive, capital investment cycles, being able to move up the supply chain and further integrate. And I think looking one step down, it's mutually advantageous across all three countries. Again, I keep coming back to this core point of end user integration. Sam, I loved your point about how the IRA is creating additional demand through EVs. I think the auto industry is clearly the archetype of regional integration and successful co-production and manufacturing, way that has made the industries in each country more internationally competitive. But it's not the only one. You have aerospace, you have electronics, the list goes on and on. I would say, just to close, I think if there is sort of one, and this goes back to your point to question to Sam, about sort of the prospects for tensions, I suppose I would say if I would foresee any, it would presumably be between the U.S. and Canada, because I think that Canada's comparative advantages within the industry, particularly when you start looking at design, you start looking at fabrication, are much more closely aligned with those of the U.S. And fortunately, that has not become a tension or a friction. But it's if I were to see one arise, I think that could be sort of one area where the CHIPS Act and sort of the very aggressive U.S. action could risk kind of creating a disparity.
I have a couple questions that are for all panelists. So if you want to chime in, let me know. The first question is about some of the inputs that we've discussed already today. The semiconductor industry requires vast amounts of resources like water, electricity, rare earth minerals, as we've heard. With the significant impact of climate change in key regions of the U.S. and Mexico, how can we make sure that new supply chains are resilient to some of these dangers? And are there ways to protect local access to resources like water to decrease the likelihood of domestic political backlash? Anyone want to answer? Max?
I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question. I mean, I could hazard a guess, but I'm not sure it'd be better than anybody in the audience.
Sam, how about you?
I don't know if I want to take on the whole question. I will say, for some of the investments we have seen proposed in the United States already, we are seeing big investments in water recycling, in environmental, in making them clean environmentally, and in renewable energy. I think it was the Micron project, though it's possible I have that wrong, that announced that they were planning to use 100% renewable energy for their project through the New York Green Chips Law. And so some of the factors you cited, I think that they make sense and we need to think about them, but they are not fixed. And we should keep in mind that this is an industry that is incredibly innovative and is thinking about these problems and thinking about solutions.
Thanks very much, Sam.
I'll add one thing, even though I think Rena probably is the expert amongst us here. In speaking with industry, I've actually heard access to renewables being a major barrier to investment in Mexico in particular, which is why I think initiatives like Plan Sonora, a lot of the other major infrastructure initiatives that are being undertaken are so important. Because basically they've all made, a lot of the leading multinationals have made very aggressive commitments to reach net neutrality within the next few decades, and are therefore really prioritizing access. But this isn't an issue that only exists in Mexico. I think in the U.S., all of the major manufacturers that exist in Arizona are pretty advanced when it comes to water recycling, sort of other, very sort of the advanced tech that Sam was mentioning. But, you recently saw, Phoenix put limits on new real estate investment because they couldn't guarantee water supply. So there's huge concerns on both sides of the border here that I think are going to be a very sort of pressing challenge that are going to have to be dealt with in a regional context. So I think, particularly along the southern border where water access is the biggest issue, those are problems that demand collaborative solutions. That's why I think that the HLED's emphasis on climate issues is essential. Pivotal driver that cuts across sectors. I also think it's important within the Mexican context. I think there's a lot of concern in within the Mexican federal government about sort of major water-intensive investment in a lot of the northern states. It's part of the reason I think the supply chain mapping efforts is so critical. I'd actually be really interested to see what the Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 supplier network looks like around Aguascalientes, the TI facility there, because that's a much more water-rich region. So I think that these are all things that companies are factoring in, and that there's a close dialogue happening between government and companies on these issues.
That's excellent. Rena, anything to add to what David said?
Yes, I entirely agree with that. Not to, I guess, address the political part of this, but in terms of the industry and what they need for development, it takes a tremendous amount of water. Some of the challenges, as David was just saying, in Mexico has been that getting permits for clean energy and some of the contractors that would work with the semiconductor companies. That has not been so streamlined. So addressing those things, I think, would help to this end. I know also that the federal government in Mexico is focusing their efforts on the southern region and looking at building that out with adequate water and electricity and kind of new infrastructure, which is great. But one of the challenges that remains is the companies that are already located there have their footprint elsewhere. So it's difficult, I think, to expect that the companies would be able to move to this new area, which might have the water and electricity. So that does remain a big challenge.
Thank you, Rena. I have one more question for all of our panelists. Anyone who would like to respond can respond, and then we'll move into the Q&A portion of the event today. We've heard a lot about regulations, heard a lot about permitting, chemicals, critical minerals. The NASC was attended by executive branches of each of the governments, but clearly we're talking here about aligning incentives and regulatory infrastructure that's going to require participation of legislative branches as well. So how do we ensure that the executive and the legislative branches of the three countries are talking, are working in unison to try to achieve some of the goals that we're talking about? I think it seems to be a very important part of this discussion. It's not just the executives, but it's also the legislatives making the fixes and providing the incentives and aligning them that they need to.
maybe.
You want to answer that, Mel?
That
one,
one-
Max?
that one I feel like
That one's squarely in your wheelhouse. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I feel comfortable with this
Yeah,
one.
go with it.
So this is what I would say. First, I would say that we, between the governments, we have the architecture in place through the conference, through the North American Leaders Summit, the High-Level Economic Dialogue, the Roadmap for Renewed Prosperity with Canada. So we've got the architecture. We also now have resources through the CHIPS Act, through ITSE. Agree, ITSE is $500 million over 5 years, not a whole lot when you start parceling it out. But we do have resources to deploy. And so I think the bottom line right now is we need to execute. We need to show proof of concept that this can work with Mexico and Canada. We need to show that we're actually driving results. And then if it's persuasive, we can ask Congress for more money. But I think that particularly with Mexico and Canada, I think we need to show that this is working, that this is delivering results, and that we have something to show for it. And then if we have a case to make to get more money, we can do so. But that would be my argument for kind of ensuring executive and legislative alignment on this.
Fantastic. Anything to add to that, Sam or Rena?
No, nothing for me. I think that was well said.
I'm happy
Fantastic.
to add a few things.
Go ahead, Dave.
So, I think there are 2 points that I would make. So one relates to the issue of regulatory alignment. It was one of the big issues that was discussed during the North American Semiconductor Conference, and I think one of the things that was actually raised by some of your State Department colleagues that I thought was very apt is that sort of North American regulatory conversations often take place within the context of these sort of bilateral or trilateral, wide-spanning regulatory dialogues, and that trying to sort of single out a specific sector and potentially bringing them into a more semiconductor-specific conversation could be an interesting way to kind of narrow focus and drive progress there. On the legislative side, that's not an issue I've thought about that much, but I think that bringing in subnational actors is key here. I think both on, across all 3 countries, you have, very strong, very strong state systems, and I think that it's where you're going to see a lot of this progress happen. I think particularly, it was great at the NSC to see some of the Mexican states there and pitching and present and engaged. Would love to see, and obviously we had Arizona sort of very well represented through ASU, but I think getting state and local officials engaged through that platform is very important. There's one entirely unrelated point that I would like to make as well before we open up the floor, is that I think we're talking a lot here about the North American context, but it being the CSIS Center for the Americas, I think it would be interesting to moving forward also explore and look for ways to broaden out this dialogue. I think there are other actors within the hemisphere who have are expressing interest in playing a role in this in this supply chain rebalancing. So I think finding ways to engage engage countries like Panama, like Costa Rica, that are expressing very significant interest in participating and being part of the solution, the resilience solution, the national security solution would be I think a commendable next step here.
That's a great point, David. I mean, we saw a couple of the foreign ministers just yesterday from Central American countries, and they were expressing similar desires as well. That one of the things they most wanted to talk about was getting involved in some of the supply chain discussions that are taking place here in the United States and North America. So it's time to open up to questions. We have Ruby Bledsoe as our program coordinator in the back at the microphone, and I think we've probably generated quite a bit of interest and many questions. So go ahead, Ruby, with the first question.
Our first question comes from Yasuko Fumoro with Sumitomo Corporation of Americas. He asks, you identified the development of human capital as very important and as a gap and a challenge in the region. Yet training and formal education takes time. What are some of the measures that the U.S. government can take to solve the skilled worker shortage in the short term? And are immigration laws, reforms, or exchange and scholarship programs necessary to solve that problem?
Okay, so it's a two-part question. The first part was, it's about the skills gap and worker training. The first is, part of the question is there something we can do in the short term to remedy the situation? The second is the question about immigration. Do we need to bring the immigration discussion into these conversations? Who wants to take this two-parter?
I can just offer
Go
a
ahead,
couple
Max.
of initial thoughts. Yeah.
Sure.
In anticipation of this conversation, I was talking to State about ITSE, and my understanding is that one of the things that money can be used for is workforce development. It can be used to develop the ecosystem in some of these countries to enable packaging or manufacture. And so again, recognizing that 500 million is not a lot of money, that is one short-term contributor to addressing this. The North American Leaders Summit also included the first ever kind of North American mobility partnership, which was supposed to try to enable student exchange and workforce development. So that's another area where we're continuing to work. Again, is it enough? Probably not. But I think there is a recognition of this being a core part of the challenge. It was certainly a topic during the conference. And so I think it's going to be an area where we're going to continue to focus on moving forward. But I agree with the premise of the question that it's difficult to solve really, really quickly. And my understanding, not being an expert on semiconductors specifically, is that it's a challenge that we have in the United States as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Rena, did you have anything to add on this?
Yes, I think, this is a global challenge. There's, of course, an upskilling and just a shortage of labor. Immigration definitely has to be part of that conversation. Aside from that, I would say that, in Mexico, the government had been giving incentives for companies that were investing in providing training and the curriculum for people who would then be able to work in some of these large semiconductor companies. That stopped recently, actually. So I think that, bringing something like that back would be key. It had been very successful. Something like this, which would make that investment worthwhile, has helped a lot, and those are the kinds of things I think which would bridge this gap. Aside from that, of course, the collaborations we have right now, with, for instance, Purdue University, which is providing training, and some of the other institutes which are providing kind of broad level training, could also be used in Canada and in the US to address these needs.
Thank you very much, Rena. Anything to add, Sam?
I just want to echo Max's point that this is also very much a US problem. And if you look at how the Commerce Department has implemented the CHIPS Act programs, focus on workforce has been one of our key pieces, has been a key piece of it for us. So you see this across both the CHIPS manufacturing programs, where we have asked applicants who are looking to build new fabs in the United States to literally give us a workforce plan about what their workforce needs are going to be and how they intend to train or otherwise find that kind of workforce that they're going to need to make the project a success. We see that as critical because without the workforce, you cannot have the fab. And given that we are going to have multiple fabs under construction at the same time and then operating at the same time, this isn't a situation where one company could just steal workers from another. We need to grow the pie. We need to be training new workers. This has also been a focus for us on the CHIPS R&D programs, where I don't know that we put out so much of this yet, but a workforce component is a component of the National Semiconductor Technology Center, and expect to see more from us on workforce there as well.
Thanks very much, Sam. David, anything to add on this?
Happy to move on to the next one.
Fantastic.
Move through the backlog.
Ruby, second question, please.
Yes, we have a question from Drew Fenner with Total Energies. He asked, how will the advancement and integration of AI across society and industry influence the government's strategic approach to high-end logic chips? And should high-end logic chips be prioritized over other chips, given that they're required inputs for AI applications?
Okay, so we have a question about AI and high-end chips, whether they should be prioritized. Sam, Rena, are either of you keen to take this question on?
I'll just say that the Commerce Department put out a I think we called it a vision statement or a vision for success, basically saying if you look 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you look back at the CHIPS program, what do we need to see in order for us to know that this program has been a success? Logic chips, in particular advanced logic chips, is high on that list, and I would expect the novel uses of them or continued use or increase in the importance of the AI industry is only going to make them more important. I'd also say this is an area that's covered elsewhere in the Commerce Department and elsewhere in government on the other side, on the protect side. And so obviously lots going on the protect side for high-end logic chips.
Thank you, Sam. Rena, anything to add to what Sam said?
No, I think that pretty much echoes what I would also have said.
All right, I think we can move on to question number 3. That was a very technical one and obviously difficult for
Yeah, we have a
response.
question from Jose, who's at the University of Chicago. He is wondering how, as the U.S. seeks to rally its allies in North America to build this semiconductor corridor, how and should the U.S. leverage its investment to safeguard democratic norms in Mexico?
Okay, how should the U.S. leverage its investment to safeguard democratic norms in Mexico?
Sure.
This is a hot one, and I wanted to give you a reprieve, Max, but...
Well, I mean, I think we would argue that a strong democratic Mexico is in the interest of the United States. And I don't think that the way that we look at the relationship is kind of transactional in that way. In other words, that with every issue, we're looking for a point of leverage, especially when we also think that it's in our interest for Mexico to help develop a semiconductor supply chain. And so we tend to avoid kind of having a transactional approach on a lot of these issues because we don't think that. We think that in and of itself, it's good for Mexico to be a democracy, and in and of itself, it's good for them to be involved in our semiconductor supply chain. And so we don't link. The policy has not been to kind of link the issues in that way and leverage them like that.
That's a great response. Anyone else want to add anything to that? It was a pretty complete response.
Yeah, I would just echo that
Okay.
same point where I think that it's one area where the Biden administration I think deserves a lot of credit is its focus on issues of democracy here at home and internationally, and obviously this is a broad and sweeping challenge that is incredibly important in its own right, stands alone as an issue, and I think that it's being well handled, and it's appropriate to consider some of these, as like separate categories the way that you're doing. So, would applaud those efforts.
Thanks, David. Third question, Ruby. Sorry, fourth question.
Our third question is, can or will the United States, Mexico, and Canada generate national champions in semiconductors for their own regional TMSC type of firm?
Oh,
How can that
interesting.
collaboration?
Interesting question. National champions. Are we going to push for national champions?
I'll start with that one.
Yeah, I'm looking at you, Sam.
From the CHIPS office perspective, I think there's a lot of ways that the U.S. government could have gone on the CHIPS program and on creating the semiconductor industry we want to see in the United States. Personally, I think we were smart to go the way we have gone, but what we have decided is that we are open to funding applications from all sorts of semiconductor producers. So that means that companies like TSMC and like Samsung and other companies not at the leading edge but that are foreign are very welcome to apply. In fact, we're encouraging their applications for CHIPS funds, and we really want to see them be producing in the United States. Companies that are US-based or located in the US, like Intel or Global Foundries, also very welcome to apply. But we're not providing any advantage in our process for US headquartered companies versus other companies. We've been clear we want an open process and we want a fair process. And the reason for that, I think, is twofold. The first is that all of these companies are building in the US as a condition of getting CHIPS Act funding. That is literally what we are funding. We're funding construction or operations in the United States. And so as long as that's happening, the United States is seeing the benefit of that construction. We're seeing the benefit of those jobs. We're getting the benefit of that supply chain resiliency. The second reason is that I think we want to be realistic about this. When there are 3 companies in the world that are producing chips or capable of producing chips on the leading edge, I think it makes a lot of sense for the United States to say, well, really, we should try to have all 3 of those here. And that's sort of the approach that you've seen us take. I think the vision statement talks about wanting to have at least 2 leading edge logic clusters in the United States as a result of this program. So at least 2. So, we're saying not necessarily all 3, but at least 2. You can sort of read into that at least a little. I think that is likely to be a good answer for us. I think we have seen other countries take other approaches, and there can be some real benefits of having a national champion. On the other hand, if that national champion is not able to keep up with the technology, and I'll just pause here a little and say this is a brutal industry with technology advances every few years, with tremendous amounts of capital needed to meet those advancements, and with sometimes people that are not successful making node transitions, and to which it can be very difficult to catch up. So if your national champion is not successful with one of those transitions, you can be quite far behind. And so I think this is the sort of thing where it makes sense for us to say, we are open for business. We want to attract everyone here. And as long as you are supporting U.S. national security and economic resilience, we're very happy to have you.
Thanks very much, Sam. Rena, I want to get your perspective on this important question.
Sure. I would also, echo also what Sam had said before, to clarify, we're not really talking about bringing pieces away from the U.S. In manufacturing to other countries. The U.S. has, for a very long time, not been doing packaging in ATP in the U.S. That has moved abroad a long time ago because, it is more cost effective to do in other locations. So that industry doesn't exist here at all anyway. And it makes sense, I think, as we have partners all around the world, to be able to rebalance those things in locations that are either closer, more aligned on all of these things, on democratic values, on trade issues and barriers, and to kind of serve also the new manufacturing that is going to be coming to the U.S. as part of this U.S. CHIPS Act. So, the U.S. CHIPS Act is definitely spurring more growth in the U.S. And there are pieces, of course, of the vast supply chain that still need to be done elsewhere. And, there's an opportunity both for Mexico and Canada, as well as, as David was mentioning, many other countries in the Northern Hemisphere that have expressed interest and could also potentially have parts to play in this.
Thanks very much, Rena. We have 4 minutes left, and I want to ask for concluding comments from each of our panelists. Just a real quick way to finish, because I think if I could summarize the tenor of the discussion today, it's a window of opportunity. There was an emphasis placed by all of our speakers on the urgency and timeliness of the moment. And so I want to start with Max and go through in the same order that we did for the opening remarks. We've heard that it's urgent. We've heard that the moment is now. We've even heard David use the word war plan to think about this. How brief is the moment? What are we talking about here?
Well, I would actually, I'll provide my concluding remarks. I would actually, people like Sam, Rena would maybe know better about how brief is the moment. But, I've heard people talk about a window that's 6 months or a window that's a year. I mean, what we do know is that the companies are making investment decisions now. So I don't know exactly kind of within that time span what the right answer is, but it does seem to be clear when you talk to industry that they're making decisions now and there's a window that's not open forever. I'll go back to my point earlier about, I think Mexico is uniquely positioned to benefit from this based on its geographic proximity, the USMCA, and these global shifts. And so this is a golden opportunity for Mexico. In terms of, without kind of recapitulating things I've said before, I did want to focus my last comments on one thing that David said that I thought was very important. And that is, we've often used North America as kind of a laboratory for policy entrepreneurship that then we've expanded to the rest of the region. And so if we have policies that are effective here, we can, in this context, we can, with our closest partners, we can use those or broaden those to the rest of the hemisphere. And I agree with him that that's something that we should look at with semiconductors in other areas as well. I think the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity is a logical place to do some of that, but I think that makes a lot of sense. And even though I'm selfishly interested in North America as the director for North America, I recognize that there's benefit in thinking about it from a broader regional context.
Rena, to you for a couple concluding remarks on, especially on the urgency of the moment.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. The companies have to make decisions which will affect their investments for 5-6 years into the future, and those decisions are being made now. And the reason for that is because just like the U.S. CHIPS Act has now passed, and similar things are coming out in the EU. Incentives are now available, and companies need to decide where they will be planning their next investments. So I think the window is not going to be open forever because those investments need to happen, and it makes the most sense to do it where it's most competitive. So I think that planning process is long, and as there is movement kind of across the globe, as many countries are offering their locations as a place to be involved with rebalancing the supply chain, that there's an opportunity here, but it will not be open for indefinitely.
Thanks, Rena. David?
First and foremost, thanks for organizing such an excellent panel. Really enjoyed showing the stage both physically and virtually with everyone here today. I think first, one point, maintaining an open investment climate here in the U.S. is also key to allied coordination. There's one point that I wanted to make in response to the final question there about national champions. I think the approach that's being taken by Commerce is exactly right there. How do you create a competitive North America? It's that's a strategy that's tried and true and tested. So maintaining an open investment climate is essential for U.S. success, both in terms of building a successful regional manufacturing ecosystem, but also on the geopolitical and geostrategic portion of this conversation. Turning to concluding remarks, I think it's been said well. I don't feel the need to repeat it. I think just the point that I would underscore here is that I do think that for this to be a trilateral endeavor, that all three governments need to step up to the table. I think that there's sort of clearly a lot of the discussion has been sort of oriented around some of the investment challenges in Mexico, which I think are real. I think there's more the U.S. can be doing here. I think there's more that the Canadians can be doing here. And I think that, because of the opportunity, because of the short time frame, because of some of the constraints that we're working within here, that this is urgent. And I would urge sort of very quick follow-up on the NASC, and then also building out a more robust trilateral agenda with a sort of more comprehensive interagency approach, and then also direct engagement with subnational actors, with end users, and other interested parties. So thank you again for having us.
Thanks, David. Over to you, Sam, to close us out. Any final reflections?
Thank you, and echo the thanks for hosting this panel. I think I agree with much of what my previous co-panelists have said on this. You asked in particular about how wide the window is, how long the window is for action here. I would say we don't know yet, and it's going to depend in some sense on what happens next. But we've already seen changes in investment patterns from these companies. People have talked about it on this panel today, but we have seen a tremendous amount of investment from semiconductor companies already in the United States and in our allied neighboring countries. And so I think we can take heart in that and saying that these investments are happening. The very fact of talking about this, the fact of passing the CHIPS and Science Act, the fact of the the various dialogues that we've been talking about today. All of those help us to achieve the outcome, which we're all looking for, which is improving national security and enhancing supply chain resilience in this critical industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I want to close by thanking all of our panelists today for this excellent discussion on a very critical topic. Obviously, this isn't the end-all, be-all. We're going to continue this very important conversation. First, Max Hamilton, North America Director at the NSC, Rena Paul Getson, the Director of Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association, David Talbot, the Associate Director of Economic Policy at the Milken Institute, and Sam Marullo, the Director of CHIPS Policy and Senior Advisor to Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimundo. Thank you very much for being here. Let's give everyone a round of applause.